Hello, my name is Susana Coroado. I'm a MSc postdoctoral researcher at the DCU Business School and in the Anti-Corruption Research Center. And in this session of the Understanding Corruption course, I'll be talking about the role of political will in combating corruption. I will talk about why anti-corruption efforts fail and what's the role of political will in that failure. What is political will, how to identify it, how to promote it, and why is it important for many stakeholders involved in anti-corruption efforts to create this political will in order to make the reforms succeed. So we'll start by answering this question: why anti-corruption efforts fail? This is probably one of the most important questions asked not only in academia but also by stakeholders in the field, by international donors, by experts working on corruption, by civil society, even by political parties. And the reasons why they fail, especially in countries where there's a transition, a political transition, but also a transition from a corrupt regime to a regime where ethical universalism is the norm. These transitions are political and not necessarily technical legal processes. This means that more or less all the technical elements, what is needed in the law, what kind of institutions and their design are necessary to create an anti-corruption reform. Those aspects are obviously context dependent, country dependent, but they're more or less identified. People know exactly how to design these policies. The problem is, although there's not a lack of expertise, there might be a lack of political will. These processes are political. They're very dependent on who's in power and who will be in power in the future to conduct these anti-corruption reforms. So the failure of the current and recent anti-corruption reforms can, to a significant extent, be understood as the result of an absence of stakeholders' willingness to act as principals. I mean, to act on the behalf of citizens that want anti-corruption reforms. And when they don't have that willingness as the ones who hold the power, then it's much more difficult to create laws, create institutions at first, but also to enforce the existing laws and policies that derive from those initial steps of the reform. So in short, in the majority of countries, it simply seems that what is lacking is real political will, without which anti-corruption reforms are bound to fail. We have probably heard this several times, not only related to corruption, but also related to other policy fields, that what is lacking or why these some reforms don't move is because of lack of political will. So why do some anti-corruption efforts succeed? And what we've seen, therefore, in the contrary, is that anti-corruption reforms succeed when actors at the very top of the system, which means politicians and senior public officials serve as role models. So they are the ones who promote change, who tell their citizens, but also their colleagues or the other public officials in lower ranks, that this is how you do to prevent, detect, and repress corruption. We have seen this in the cases of Hong Kong and Singapore, which are probably one of the most impressive examples of successfully fights against corruption from the top. In other words, in these cases and in other successful cases, there was political will to design, adopt, and implement these anti-corruption policies. So, what we see is that we need to define what is political will, because it's quite easy to say, well, what is lacking is political will. A certain reform failed because of lack of political will. But what exactly is this? So some scholars actually call it the slipperest concept in the policy lexicon, because it's one of those concepts that it's a buzzword that is very easy to say it and to justify. But what does it actually mean? And it's only when we are able to empirically define it is that we are able to solve the problem of lack of political will. In other words, of how to create that political will. So we have here a definition of Brinkenhoff about a political will. This is an American academic who has written a lot about this concept related to corruption. And so he claims that the political will is the commitment of actors to undertake actions to achieve a set of objectives. In this particular case, the objective is to reduce corruption and to sustain the costs of those actions over time. This means that the actors who are on top, who are able to make decisions, so those who hold the power, are willing to first display a credible public commitment to the fight against corruption, and then to translate that public commitment into real actions. And so this is the more vague definition, but there are others. McMenamin, for instance, defined it a bit more. So he defines it as the sum of political want, political can, and political must. This means that for power holders to commit an act in favor of a certain cause, they need to want to take a given action, to feel confident that they can actually do it, and we'll see in 2 slides what this actually means, the confidence or the ability to actually take action, and the fact that they do take that action. So it's a 3-dimensional concept. But once again, what does this mean in practice? What does it mean political want, political can, and political must. So there are some indicators of political will that can help us identify or not the political will in anti-corruption reforms. So the first is the government initiative and public commitment. We can see that, for instance, by looking at the ratification of international treaties against corruption. We can see that through speeches, through electoral promises and government programs, the adoption of national laws, which might mean already some action, but not fully, because laws need to be enforced. But so it's this willingness, this speaking out in defense of the fight against corruption with specific promises or manifestos. Also, the choice of policies and programs and institutional models based on evidence, on the analysis of options, on anticipated outcomes and cost-benefit analysis. So this means that you can not only say that you're going to adopt a certain law, that you're going to create an institution, but that you actually do it in a committed way, that power holders do study and try to make the best possible policy, the best possible institutional model, that they do this in a way that is also sustainable over time. The third indicator is the mobilization of stakeholders. And this can be, for instance, the opposition, because we know that corruption reforms, anti-corruption reforms take a lot of time, so they need the commitment of those who in the future might be in power to continue the reform, but also others that have a huge influence in the implementation of these reforms. For instance, the judicial system, ombudsman, the police, regulators in general, political parties, NGOs, public servants. So you need to get everyone in the room and everyone heard and incentivized to participate in the implementation of the reform. It also political will is also translated into allocation of resources. So it doesn't matter to have great policies on paper. Governments need to make sure that they allocate the significant, or at least the necessary resources in terms of budget, in terms of human resources, that will be technical resources, technological resources that will allow for the good implementation of the policy. There's also a need to apply credible sanctions. If a government doesn't contribute to this, probably because it didn't provide the police with enough resources, because it didn't prioritize anti-corruption in their policies, because it didn't engage with the judicial reform, then credible sanctions won't be applied. And so if you don't sanction those who still engage in corruption simply because you don't want to, you don't show political will. And this is particularly important because those in power are sometimes those who have very cozy relationships with stakeholders in and outside the political system that engage in very high-level grand corruption or systemic corruption. And so those who really want to fight corruption really need to stand against those who could be their allies before, but now are definitely adversaries in the fight against corruption. We also need the continuity of efforts. So, as I said before, governments need to engage with the opposition in order to make sure that the efforts will continue over time, even if they lose their office and some other political force comes into power. And finally, a seventh indicator of political will is learning and adaptation. So this means that reforms need to be analyzed, need to be adapted, errors need to be identified and solved in order to promote and fix the anti-corruption policies. And obviously, this requires a lot of political will itself, because it means that political stakeholders need to promote analysis and need to eventually admit that not everything went well. But the fact that they do this, when they do this, it really displays political will and commitment to the anti-corruption reforms. The big question is, why would politicians do this? How to convince them to adopt all these 7 steps? Because the core of the political will, whether negative or positive, meaning whether the political will is actually trying to promote anti-corruption reforms or actually undermine it, mainly comes from the interactions and social and political and economic dynamics among actors within a country, along with the international factors that provide incentives for or against the reform. So, how to create those incentives? Why would those in power, and we should not forget that corruption is a problem of power. Those who have the power are the ones that engage in corruption, and those who have great power, like politicians that actually hold most of the power in a society, at least formally, they are the ones that might be involved in corruption. So there's a lot of disincentives for politicians not to pursue anti-corruption reforms. So their political will actually guides them against anti-corruption reforms, or guide them to undermine those reforms. And the reasons are because politicians, as I said, are often the main beneficiaries of corruption, because the reporting and the conviction of corruption cases remain extremely low, So this means that sanctions are not being imposed, that the probability of being detective, of being denounced by corruption is so small that it's worth taking the risk. And finally, because unfortunately, corrupt politicians often stand good chances for re-election. Because they exchange favors for political donations, because they distribute jobs or other our benefits to their party members, to society, or to a network of people who then become dependent on them. And so this means that they have higher chances of getting elected. So if they fight corruption and will create a more integrity-based and meritocratic environment, then they'll might lose the support of these citizens or of these groups. So there's a lot of disincentives for politicians to engage with anti-corruption reforms. There's also some incentives, and those should be the ones that should be worked on. So reputation is a good incentive, and here reputation goes top up and bottom down. This means that reputation might work when, for instance, politicians are being pressured by international organizations, by international donors, that they need, from a personal point of view, but also from a national point of view, so point of view of the country, they need to maintain their reputation. They need to make sure that their country and themselves are portrayed as being an anti-corruption champion, or at least doing some efforts in order to have political and sometimes financial gains from international or external stakeholders. But also reputation from within. Reputation, for instance, with voters. A commitment to fight corruption might influence citizens to vote for them. It's also important to, reputation is also quite important to attract international investment and multinational companies. On the other hand, politicians might also engage in anti-corruption reforms because they do not expect them to be successful, but sometimes they are. And so they also, because of reputation, they will say, well, yes, we want to adopt these reforms, thinking that after adopting them on paper, then they can undermine it. But they turn out to be to actually be successful because of the engagement of the society and of the legal system. And so they turn out to work out well. So what are the drivers of political will? Well, we have individual factors. So the personal beliefs, the aspirations, the motivations of each actor. So some have more than others. So that's why it's important to identify the anti-corruption champions. For instance, there are also organizational factors, mandates, culture, established practices. For instance, a political party that has very entrenched corruption practices and depends a lot on external funding from corrupt business people, for example, will probably, even if it has a very committed individual, it will be hard for him to change the system within its own political party. So even more when we talk about public organizations that are victim of systemic corruption. There's also relational factors and how power holders engage with citizens, with civil society, and with other powers, and how they are pressured or sensitive to the pressure of civil society. Finally, there's societal factors, the legacies of authoritarianism or dictatorship, systems of informal decision making outside the established government institutions. All of this can have an impact on how political will is shaped and how it's actually translated into actions. There's also constraints to positive political will. For instance, insincere strategic support. As I mentioned before, sometimes politicians say they will adopt anti-corruption policies just to then undermine them. So maintaining a reputation of action, but actually doing the opposite. Lack of ability, mostly due to lack of resources, due to the organizational factors that I mentioned in the previous slide. So it's the context is difficult to change. Also the political cycle and the change in actors in power. So political will cannot be dependent on the person or the political power, the political party that is in office at a given time, but it really needs, it's really dependent on the willingness of future power holders. And then other contextual changes, for instance, the easing of external pressure. I mean, sometimes international organizations or donors create a lot of pressure at the beginning, but then that pressure fades away, and so power holders have less incentives to continue the efforts, or because citizens are disengaged, or there's a lot there's a lack of social and political trust, and a lot of cynicism in society. So why and to whom does it matter to know how to create this political will? Well, it's important for civil societies and civil society and NGOs, for international donors, for international organizations such as the UN, the OECD, the World Bank. It's also important for political parties with a strong anti-corruption agenda, and citizens at large, because they are the ones who also benefit from anti-corruption reforms in a given country, and so they're the ones that actually create pressure and lobby for these anti-corruption reforms. And why is it important to understand what does it mean in a given country, political will, and how to create it? Because sometimes all these stakeholders need to create a momentum, need to choose the right timing to launch a public campaign for this, and to define strategies, and also to examine how reliable political actors in office are, in order to trust them and to give them funding, etc. So just to wrap up, we saw that political will is a key aspect in the fight against corruption, but it's a complex and fragile one. It really depends on contextual factors, on incentives and disincentives, and what we actually need to build it is broad national coalitions that promote political will. And here, there's a crucial role for the international community to support those who are engaged in this and make them broad and more powerful. Thank you.